Right. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
So it is my absolute pleasure to begin this webinar today. I am Kia Darling-Hammond. I'm the founder and CEO of Wise Chipmunk LLC, which provides education and research consulting to individual schools and businesses. I study thriving possibilities for people who experience complex marginalization. Today in our conversation about public health disparities with attention to the crisis of Black youth suicide, I shared this virtual stage with 4 leader scholars in the work of Black health and well-being. Dr. Alfiee Breland-Noble, known as Dr. Alfiee, founder and board president of the AAKOMA Project. Dr. Shawn Ginwright, CEO of Flourish Agenda. Mr. David Johns, the executive director at the National Black Justice Coalition. And Dr. Kimani Norrington-Sands, clinical psychologist and author. Everybody here is going to say a little bit more about themselves. And even though I gave titles, that's just barely the tip of the iceberg of what these wonderful folks do. So without further ado, I'd like to get us started with the first question, which I'm going to begin by posing to Dr. Alfiee. So we are, all of us, part of legacies, right? Lines that reach back before we drew breath and reach forward beyond what we'll be here to witness. And with that in mind, I'd like to invite you to just talk a little bit about what brings you to this work and who you're bringing in with you as you do this work.
So I had to change I was hearing here and I have my headphones in, so I apologize. So I'm start here, Wakanda Forever, my Howard University brother, Chadwick Boseman. I'm an HU girl through and through. You cut me, I bleed blue and white. I tell everybody that. And who I bring with me is my ancestry, the mothers and the fathers, the people who, it makes me emotional, the people who didn't have the opportunity to go to school and earn what I've been able to earn, had to fight for, let's be honest. And I do this for all the people coming behind me, all the people who still are denied opportunities, who are in toxic work environments. I'm a psychologist in that psychology space and training. When they get out into the world and think it's gonna be better and it's still hostile and they don't know what it is. And I want all my young people to know, all my people to know, it's not you. It's that toxic environment. It is not you. And so that's who I bring with me. I have to honor, you know, you gave me an opening. I'm so sorry, I'm taking too long, but it is for me so deeply valuable to recognize all the people who came before, who just did not have the opportunity. So that's who I bring into this space with me, and all my young people who feel like suicide is the way and is the solution. I bring those people with me too, because it's not the solution, and we want to provide support so they don't feel like that's the solution.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, that's powerful. Dr. Jin Wright, would you be willing to answer the question as well? What brings you to the work and who do you bring with you to the work?
Well, thanks for the question, Kia, and thank you for this important conversation and discussion. You know, what brings me to this work is I've been working in Black communities, specifically with young people, my entire career. And I bring with me the parents, the grandparents, my own family, my grandparents, who have really tried to find ways to address suffering in our communities. I bring my ancestors who have fought, who have died, who have struggled, who have dreamed and hoped and prayed for my presence to be here right at this very moment. And I bring them into this space. If I had more time, I could show you a picture behind me of an old shack my mama grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. And it is with that old shack that she grew up in reminds me and roots me in every decision that I make, and the love that I bring to the work in liberating Black people. So that's what brings me to the work.
I'm so glad I asked this question. Thank you so much for that. I really feel like this gives us a very human start to what we're trying to do here today. Dr. Kimani Norrington-Sands, would you be willing to add your perspective?
Absolutely. I definitely agree with what my colleagues said, that we are standing on the shoulders of greatness, and that, you know, the struggle continues, and we see that every day. It doesn't matter what your level of professional attainment is. It doesn't matter how much money you have. The struggle continues. And I definitely agree that as we're having this conversation about Black youth suicide, is how do we teach our children that we can make a way out of a no way? And how do they look in terms of what our ancestors have gone through and what we're continuing to go through, that we are making a way out of a no way, and that we can persevere because we have persevered and we will. But in terms of instilling that sense of hope, that we can build upon what we've already gone through.
Thank you so much. And of course, last and never least, Mr. David Johns.
Happy to, and just say thank you to you, Kia, for helping to moderate this conversation. It'll be no surprise we've all done work together. I think the work we do is purpose-driven, so there'll be threads that will bind us all throughout. I am the son of Black feminist. I'm the beneficiary of people who to this day conspire for my success. That includes ancestors who dreamt and sacrificed not knowing that I would show up and be the manifestation of those dreams or those sacrifices. And I show up into the work in the spirit of Asa Hilliard, who said, it reminds me that I've never met a child, in particular a Black child, who is not a genius. There's no secret to how we support them. We acknowledge them as human, interestingly enough, and we support them with love. I show up in the spirit of our brother Bide Rustin and our sister Marsha P. Johnson, who remind us that as long as there have been Black people before the terms lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans existed, there were Black gatekeepers, is what Some called them, referencing us in her village. And so I show up as an educator, as an agitator, as someone who will always get into good trouble, to ensure that our babies have the ability to thrive.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And with all of that in our hearts and in our minds, I'd like to begin this next question directed to Dr. Kimani Norrington-Sands. As we know that our communities face numerous and particular challenges to our health and well-being. Mm-hmm. And in your work, which disparities, we're here to talk about disparities in healthcare and in particular Black youth suicide, which disparities rise to the top, and especially among children and youth?
Well, there's so many disparities, right? So when we look at systemic oppression, it touches every element of our society. And so those disparities show up in terms of mental health, particularly in terms of well-being. And when we think about disparities, what compounds the disparities is the ongoing experience of trauma. So unfortunately, many of us, and many of our youth have ongoing experiences of trauma. So it's not post-traumatic, it's ongoing experiences of racism and trauma. And how do they learn to cope with that if they're constantly being traumatized? So we think about the issues of depression, we think about anxiety. Also in terms of post-traumatic stress, there's research that shows that when our youth are exposed to, and we see they're constantly exposed to these issues of racial violence and trauma, when they're constantly exposed to that, then that can cause post-traumatic stress types of symptoms. And so thinking about that and thinking about other issues that Black youth have to contend with, then that increases the likelihood they may experience mental health challenges. And not that we don't have protective factors, because, you know, we've learned, you know, generationally that we keep on pushing on and pushing on. But recognizing that our realities for our children now are very different from when we grew up. And so there's so much that they have to contend with. And now we're seeing the increase of suicide for Black youth, and it's like exploded. We have rates that show, like for certain age groups, that the rates now are surpassing that for white youth. So interestingly, the rates for Black youth are increasing and the rates for white youth in certain age groups are decreasing. And what's most concerning about this as well is, number one, there's little awareness that this is happening. Number two, there's a stigma within our community about mental health treatment, and definitely suicide. And I'm speaking from the perspective, not only professionally, but also from a survivor. My father died by suicide more than 30 years ago. And just my personal experiences and my professional has really compelled me to really talk about this issue. So when we think about disparities, we really have to have honest conversations about what's happening and recognize when our children need help and get them that help, right? So we have to really work through the stigma, and we also have to destigmatize the issue of suicide. That is a cry for help. And a lot of times our kids, our youth are crying out for help, and those cries are missed. So how do we recognize those signs, and how do we get appropriate services, culturally grounded services for our youth, so they know that they can make a way out of a no way? With depression, of course, we know that tunnel vision, it feels very hopeless, but there is a way out of a no way. And for those of us who have experienced the loss of a loved one to suicide, for us to have open conversations about that. I just know that, in my experience, there was so much stigma about suicide. And after my dad died, there was, nobody wanted to talk about it. So I have learned from that pain and those experiences, how can I then help, liberate, right? So you talked about what brought us to this work, not only my ancestors, but the future generations, right? So how are we saving our babies, amidst all the trauma they're going through? How do we provide a psychological armoring for them in terms of those protective factors, in terms of building them up and let them know that they're grounded in greatness, even though there's so much around them saying that they're not, right? So how do we do that? So disparities, yes, there's many disparities in many ways, but we also have to recognize that our kids are constantly being traumatized. So what are we doing not only individually to help our kids, but we have to look at policy too, right? So we have to stop the root of why they're constantly being traumatized. So that's, my perspective in terms of how to address the disparities.
Thank you. And everyone else on the panel has real expertise and experience with this as well. I'd like to invite anyone to jump in to add their thoughts to this question of what are the disparities that rise to the top as you see them in your work, and in particular, how do they interact with youth and children's lives?
One thing I would say is that in terms of the actual, when we think about epidemiology, let me start there. The rates of depression, right? The most recent data that we have, we don't really see significantly different rates, statistically significantly different rates of issues like depression and anxiety. Where we see the rates differ drastically is who is accessing care. And that issue of access to care is multifaceted. So that's one point I wanted to stress. And it speaks to everything our sister, Dr. Norrington-Sands, just shared. I'm also mindful, because I've learned so much from my brother, Mr. David Johns, about subpopulations that we don't talk about, within our community that bear a disproportionate brunt of suicide, depression, anxiety, trauma, even under the umbrella of being Black. And that's for our same gender loving and queer young folks. I won't speak to that because that's not my area of expertise, but I do want to acknowledge that it's important that we uplift those young people, because I was just on a call a couple days ago, and I remember what the call was, and the issue came up. I was just speaking generally about how important marginalized communities are to me. Some people don't like that terminology. I do, because marginalized is a label that describes what our experience is. It doesn't describe who we are. If I were to say we were marginal, that's an adjective applied to me. But if we're marginalized, that really speaks to what happens in society. And so even among us as Black people, there are populations of us there are portions of our population who really are additionally marginalized. And I would say some of those folks are under the umbrella of queer, as well as people who are struggling with mental health concerns. So severely and persistently, people who are struggling with severe and persistent mental illness. Let me say it like that. I would also say that in terms of disparities, access to care is not just about money. I feel like it's so important to tell people that. even middle class, upper middle class, folks with means, folks with access, working class folks who have good insurance, we still are underrepresented among those who access and make use of care. And I understand why. It's because when you go into care, you don't see people who look like you. 4% of all psychologists in the United States are Black. 2% of all psychiatrists in the United States are Black. Those numbers are pretty steady across other racial ethnic groups. So the likelihood that you're going to find someone who understands your experience is slim. And then the final thing I'll say is this whole concept of how important for in this moment, the acknowledgement of racial trauma is. I'm old enough to remember that, you know, when I started, nobody talked about racial trauma. It was people out there doing the work without question. It's people always been doing the work, but getting it funded, which is part of what we did with the task force that we worked on trying to put together the bill with Bonnie Watson-Coleman's office that all of us in some form or fashion were connected to. That's the argument that we make. People would not literally give you money. And let's remember, it's all of our tax dollars coming from the National Institutes of Health. So it should be equitable distribution of who gets access to the money to create the research. And so the data that came out of that wouldn't pay for racial trauma work, but that's a core facet of Black people's mental health is the racial trauma. So anytime something comes up that's new, when we talk about is I follow David on social media, I'm always learning about, you know, the almost epidemic of Black trans women being killed and injured. We don't talk about that enough. And so because we don't have those kinds of issues centered, we are not able to then get the funding to go build interventions and preventive interventions and mental health interventions to build support around that work. We're also, back to Dr. Norrington-Sands' point, not able to make use of the factors of resilience that come from our communities. Because my attitude is a rising tide lifts all boats. So if you can figure out what's going to get Black folks into mental health care, you can pretty much help everybody else. And so those other disparities, I think it's a slightly additional take on disparities is access to resources to create improvements that are going to benefit people. So those are some of the things that I would add, and I'm going to put him on the spot. I would love to hear more, because it's not my expertise, about the populations of us as Black people who rarely, if ever, are discussed in these conversations about mental health.
I'm happy to be put on the spot, and I'll celebrate that being an active accomplice in the work of radically inclusive social justice looks like what you just did, Doc. It is seldom the case that I, as the often resident Black queer representative, get to hear somebody else name our community. And so I will always happily take a back seat to watching you do your thing and make space for all of us to thrive. I will supplement what has been said by lifting up three things. One is Ted Kennedy, who I had the pleasure of working for, used to always say a rising tide lifts all ships. And I didn't quite have the language and the courage at the time, to be quite honest, to say to him, that's cute if you have a ship. And what I'm mindful of, to the points that have been made, is that for a long time, many of us have not been in anything close to a ship, but we've been making do. And there are some among us, Black trans, Black queer, Black non-binary folks, Black folks with disabilities, most of them hidden or invisible, who often don't have any of the kinds of resources that members of our community take for granted while making do. And so, to the points that have been made and some of the questions that have been raised, children, students in elementary school and middle school and in high school who experience both trauma as a result of being members of racial and ethnic minority communities and sexual minority communities are more likely than their cisgendered heterosexual counterparts to experience the kinds of depression, isolation, and other mental health challenges that lead to suicidal ideation, completion, and the like. And so it's really important for us to be mindful of that, if only for the reason that we're not even having this discussion in public. I'm still very much concerned for and grieving on behalf of hundreds of thousands of young people who didn't get to say goodbye to their friends at the end of the school year, or who didn't get to go to prom after we told them through books and media and stories that we share about this rites of passage, or graduate, or get the job that we told them that they would otherwise inherit if they do the things that one is expected to do. And so acknowledging the points that have been made, recognizing the work that's been done by people like Joy DeGruy, Dr. Joy DeGruy, excuse me, respect her name. It is important for me that we do this work of not only addressing stigma, identifying that like one of the training flaws in the industry is that few people are competent on issues concerning race, and even fewer practitioners have intersectional competence. So it often forces those of us who show up in a medical provider's office to pick and choose which part of ourselves we want to work on healing first when we show up as whole people in the world. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done on all of this. And the saddest thing for me, again, reflected in the report, Ring the Alarm, I put it in the chat, there's some more commentary about it, is that most of what was in the report is not new. The thing that is new is that the rate is doubled. The rates of suicide attempts and completion for young Black folks have doubled in the last 20 years while they have decreased for everyone else. That part is new. The challenges that our babies face, the reasons why we don't talk about it as communities, the fact that people are suffering in silence and dying as a result of stigma is not necessarily new. And there are things like technology and Facebook groups that normalize the kinds of feelings that might lead one to contemplate suicide. That stuff is new in ways that are exacerbating the challenges that our communities face, and in moments where we are suffering with related crises, like the reality that you cannot get federal funding in this moment to do this work because there's an executive order forcing people to not do anything that is connected to critical race theory, right? Like something that we have had to carve out in the academy that white folks erected to codify their privilege. So I just want to be clear that we are fighting multiple battles on multiple fronts, and at the core is forcing people to reckon with the vestiges of anti-Blackness, white supremacy, their twin cousins, homophobia, misogyny, trans misogynoir, and the like, such that people can understand that they are worthy of feeling everything that they naturally feel and finding ways to thrive because of it. And seek to do so, especially when it's inconvenient, because Black folks are inconvenienced by everything that exists in the world, because that exists by design.
Dr. Jin Wright.
Yeah, so much to talk about here on that question. And, you know, David and Dr. Breland-Noble and Dr. Norrington-Sands, I think laid all of the important issues that our young people are facing. One of the things I wanted to say is that, you know, some of the research that was done probably over 20 years ago by Dr. Alvin Poussant really called into question the way in which we even think about suicide as sort of, he calls it slow suicide, which is this sort of ongoing high risky behaviors, ultimately leading into to completion. And I think that one of the things that we see is that young people all have very few options to actually deal with and get support around their own mental health. And in fact, in our communities, there's a significant stigma around what constitutes mental health. And so part of, I'm sorry, my doorbell is ringing. I don't know if y'all heard that. But part of, I think what we need to be thinking about is a radical healing nation. And that is, we need to be able to saturate young people, Black young people and their families with opportunities for well-being. I believe that we are at a point in our society, and I don't assume that I don't assume that trauma is located specifically with certain young people in certain neighborhoods. Right now, as we sit in this very moment, Black people in this society are experiencing trauma. You, me, all of us. And for us to assume that our own mental health is intact, right? And despite the fact that we have different social class and different resources, we all are experiencing some form of disruptive mental health. Just for the fact that we have so much uncertainty right now about what next year will look like. So the challenge is that we have to, one, acknowledge that this ongoing exposure to racist, toxic policies, structural inequality. Dr. Norrington-Sands has already articulated that this is not, that there's nothing post about the trauma that we face that is persistent. In my own work and when I teach my graduate students, I teach them to stop using the term post-traumatic stress disorder, and to use the term persistent traumatic stress environment, PTSD, because it highlights the persistence of stress, and it talks about the disease is not in the individual, it's not in people, the disease is in the environment, it's in the structures and the laws and policies that create suffering. And so if we understand that as persistent traumatic stress environment, that forces us to think differently about how we actually provide behavioral and mental health. That means we have to disrupt the sort of European standard of thinking that mental health happens at the individual level. My boy was telling me, one of my friends was telling me, wrote this whole chapter about collective mental health. He said, basically what you're saying is, if I'm sick, we sick. If I'm well, we well. And that means that we have to think about providing behavioral and mental health, not as only sort of clinical, medical, therapeutic, lay on the couch kinds of interventions, but we have to saturate young people's opportunities to become well. I think schools need to be places of well-being. I think when young people go to the barbershop, they need to have mental health conversations with their barbers. And when they go to the beauty salons, we need to normalize mental health conversations, because we will never be able to address the mental health crisis with the kinds of mental health supports that we have in our country. So I'll stop there, but a lot more to say.
Thank you. Wow, that's a lot to really think about and consider and take in. And I think that we began to start to sort of think about, and thank you for that, what's next, the what do we do, the solution side of this. I wonder if I could I study thriving, and so I'm going to invite folks to do a quick exercise, which is to just imagine and describe what the world that we want to see looks like. Just to take a moment to speak on what a future where these challenges have dissipated looks like, from your perspective. Can you just, with me, briefly describe that world we have not yet seen? Can I begin with you, Dr. Jin Wright?
First of all, I love the question because for a number of levels, so I'm going to try to answer the question, but I want to tell you why I love it so much. Because I am guilty of problem loving. I am guilty of being trained to love the problem, to saturate and only think about measuring and detecting and analyzing and predicting the problem. I haven't been trained as a sociologist very much to imagine a possible future. And this question that you raise is one that we need to also integrate into our own thinking and doing in Black America. That is, what is the world we dream about? What is the conditions of the communities we want to see? We need to use terms that become normalized. So we use terms like fight, resist, confront, deconstruct. All of these things are necessary, but they're only one half of the equation, because we also have to dream, imagine, invent, discover. All of these kinds of things are just as important, right? And those latter words allow us to move into the future that we want to see. My ancestors, you asked this question, Kia, my ancestors did not dream, they did not fight for, as Africans were enslaved, they didn't say we want an easier form of slavery. They dreamed of freedom. And so so it is incumbent on us is to really dream of the thing we want. If Africans didn't dream of freedom, they would have wanted a better form of being enslaved. And I think that is our question. So I love the question, first of all. Let me stop. Let me right there. What is the world that I want to see? I want to see my world in 2026 or 2030 is a world where children are playing in the streets with fire hydrants on, that they're laughing and joyously playing, and then their mama comes out and calls them into the house to eat a beautiful dinner. And then they spend some time learning on the computer. They go to the park and they're with their family and friends. I want to see Black families intact, healthy, whole, and complete. I call this the opposite of anti-Black racism. No one has really pushed and thought about the opposite of anti-Black racism. The opposite of anti-Black racism, sometimes we think the absence of what we want, the absence of sickness doesn't constitute health. The absence of violence does not constitute peace. The absence of anti-Black racism doesn't constitute what we want. I want to see, I'm using the term future Black belonging, right? That we have a future that we can lean into and create that saturates and supports our young people and our families with well-being, healing, hope, and togetherness, right? I'm gonna stop there because I've said enough, but that's a great question, and that's what I'd want to see.
And I want to mirror that. At first when you asked the question, I was like, what? Because I am like that as well, right? So we've been trained in terms of this is the problem, this is how we address the problem, right? But in terms of thinking about what we want, how we want to strive for that, I would say first and foremost that I want us to have physical and psychological safety at the base level, right? So if we think about other things we want, we need to have that basic level of safety. And then, as you mentioned, Dr. Ginwright, is in terms of us thinking about not in terms of the fight, right? All the time. Yes, the fight is involved in that, but there's other forms of resistance. And Girl Trek actually talks about that. I don't know how many of you have been following Girl Trek, but they've been talking about that joy, love, wellness, health, even our ability to breathe, as we're seeing right now. These are all forms of resistance. And for us to embody forms of resistance, but in a positive way, right? What things are we doing to support our individual and collective wellness? That's the world I would want to see. And whatever way that looks like, that is what I would strive for and support.
You waiting on me, Doc? So I wrote down three things. I disagree with one thing Shawn said, in that it's that he spoke too much. The sociologist in me double taps everything that he said. And so I'll stay in that space and answer the question that way, which is, Kia knows this, many of you know this, I'm completing my PhD at Columbia. It should be lost on no one that many of us are invited. Du Bois said that those of us who have the ability are required to obtain credentials, certificates, and degrees from institutions that have been erected to prevent us from doing the kind of work that we're talking about. And so for those who don't understand this, what we have been talking about in terms of our training is the process of not being able to talk about and name racism and anti-Blackness and poverty and capitalism as the root cause, but instead to talk about isolated incidents of individuals not being able to do enough to shift the environment that, again, Brother Shawn mentioned. And so with that as a framework, I'm super excited that I get to work with a group of young people who are part of NBJC's Youth and Young Adult Advisory Council. Kia manages that work, who are working with me as I complete my dissertation to critique the set of data that we collect to measure students' academic experiences and progress. And so for me, very much related to that, my dream includes, one, young people who are unencumbered by the burden of anti-Blackness and poverty and the trappings of capitalism. And so very specifically as it relates to my work, that means them being free from the pressures of standardized exams and the lies that those things tell about merit or meritocracy or the privilege that white people and people who have access to privilege based on their whiteness or other things related to it enjoy. And so that's first and foremost. The second thing is, as was mentioned by Dr. Norrington-Sands, which is the literal ability to be safe, happy, and whole. Too often, we as Black people are forced to choose, am I gonna be safe and stay in the house, or am I gonna risk my life to go vote and get this lunatic out of office? And too often also, we are forced to choose, am I going to buy these groceries or am I gonna pay to sit and talk to a therapist? And a part of what we are required to do is ensure that people don't have to make choices that require them to otherwise cut themselves in halves. And then the last thing is this freedom to be. Too often I think about, especially now, and let me be clear, I am happy about and am proud to show up in the world in the way that God purposed me to. And there are times where I think about, if I were not burdened by the problems of white folks and their greed, what else could I be doing? So many of us are committed to doing things that are extensions of like being race warriors. And seldom do we get to think about it because like it's natural to us. This is what we see in the world. These are the opportunities that we've been given. These are the ways in which we can try and fix it. And we literally expend our lives. Some of us die early trying to do this work. And so the thing that I struggle with, that I'm literally trying to work through actively in therapy, is like, what does it mean to be in a space where I accept what has been and resent it because I'm also asking what could be different if this wasn't the burden that we're all forced to deal with? And so the last part of this for me is like the freedom to just be, and that not be constricted by all of the things that we've talked about that lead us to the reality that we're trying to get away from today.
Yeah, that reminds me of this idea, you know, how I was raised and how I, in some ways, raised my own children, right? We've all heard the term, you know, we got to be twice as good, right? That notion of twice as good it means that I can't live free.
It also suggests that these mediocre ass white kids are half as good as we suggest that they are. And if there's ever been a question about that, I would refer to y'all's occupant of the Oval Office. My is still doing good work. But that, Shawn, to me goes to the core of it. Most of us can recite the moment in the episode of Scandal where Kerry Washington was standing in an airport hangar and Papa Pope said, "What did I teach you?" And she literally said, "I got to work twice as hard to get half as far." For me, what gets missed in that is not just the trauma on Black kids. When I worked in the White House, I would ask Black kids that, and they always talked about like proving people wrong. I love proving people wrong. That to me is not the most pernicious part of it. That white people and their privilege and the lie that allows them to have their privilege gets erased in all of that is what I worry most about.
So to take us back to the visionary imagining, the world that we would love to see is absent that lie. We are 7 minutes away from our hard stop, so I want to make sure that Dr. Alfiee has a chance to respond to the question. And I love all of this, and then I'm going to ask one last question before we go. This is amazing, Dr. Alfiee.
It is. So just two things. One is the dream that I have. I worked on a project in Jamaica about 7 or 8 years ago, and one of our papers that we never put out, I don't know what happened, but the paper's called Dream a World. You know, that's not how they say it in Jamaica, right? A dream a world. And so in the project that we worked on, I think I always come back to that. And two things for me. One is my wish is that every single human, primarily those of us who are Black, part of the diaspora, would wake up every day knowing that I'm valuable just because I exist. Period. Period. That's it. And the second is, you know, in all the spaces that we exist in, so I teach my kids, I have a 9th grader and an 11th grader, and I'll stop. No is a complete sentence. That's what I dream, right? You say no, you use that magical word no, all the things that I just, particularly Brother John's talking about mediocrity, right? You know, we have this thing we say, I teach the young people I mentor, I said, look, I want you to have the confidence of a mediocre white man, because a mediocre white man is going to ask for everything in the world, whether he deserves it or not. And I want you to have that kind of confidence to come into the world. And so you can come into the world that way, I believe, when you wake up knowing every day that you are valuable just because you exist.
I love that. And so holding the energy of being able to be, to simply be, to love ourselves, to be whole, in this present moment, and in particular, you know, in relationship to what your work with youth has taught you, right? Each of you work with young people, talk to young people. What is it that we, caring and concerned adults who make up the majority of this audience, those of us who are here on this panel, can do concretely to interrupt and reduce and eliminate these health disparities, and in particular, Black youth suicide? If there's something very specific and actionable, that would be really helpful. I'll start with Mr. David Johns and then let others chime in.
Yeah, I'll try and be brief. One is we can listen to them. Period, full stop. Too often adults listen to young people to respond, to interject, to let them know all that we've done so that it's not as hard as they think that it is. And we need to just listen. It's hard to be young, gifted, and Black in this moment. And so the first thing we can do is to listen to the babies. The second thing related to that is to support them in naming and honoring all of their feelings, allowing them to feel all of the feels, and then equipping them with all of the support they need in order to thrive. And so in the same way that we will get nutritionists and a trainer when we're working on our body and our fitness, we need to equip them with competent and qualified mental health support so that they can thrive. And then the last thing, very selfishly, is for adults to get out of the way. I don't care in this moment. I hope y'all lean in this moment. I don't care about your personal feelings about anybody else's sexual identity, gender orientation, or expression. Too often, we get into conversations about queer stuff, and people are concerned about who's having sex with whom and how, and seldom do people talk about love. So much of what I think is the thread through all of what we said, in particular, Dr. Alfie's last comment, is too many of our babies don't feel loved. That's how you get to feeling like there's no way for me to go forward and this is my only option. And so I'm saying to you that you can learn some new letters in the acronym. You can Google some articles and some books to increase your competence. You can tap in other folks who are much more caring and compassionate than you are until you can hold the space required to show up for the babies that you brought into the world. And if you can't do that, then you might not deserve to have the little babies that you would get invited into the world. But I don't think that that's necessarily it. I just think you need to do better. And so if there are ways that NBJC can be helpful, I hope that people will leverage us as a resource. But I hope that people understand that I'm saying this on behalf of your children who can't look at you and let you know that you're crazy, because you invited them into this world. You allow these systems to persist, and it's your responsibility to do what's required to make sure that they are well, and whatever that means for them.
And I want to just really quick, three things, because I want to piggyback or whatever, veggie back, that's whatever. So on what David said, so three things. You can't pour water into a glass if yours is empty, right? And so I think the first thing is for adults to take care of themselves, right? To really develop a practice of our own behavioral mental health. We experience stress, we experience all the toxicity that comes at us. And it's hard for us to actually be present in a way that's healthy, whole, and complete for young people if we don't have our own practice. What are we doing to take care of ourselves? One, that could be anything from meditation, take care of your physical health, whatever it is, but how are we taking care of it? Two, you need to develop an emotional literacy. Like, I know my work with my own son and hundreds of other Black young people I work with don't have the emotional literacy to talk about what they feel. And this is like mostly from African-American young men, and that comes from various forms of toxic masculinity. But I ask young men who lost a friend and they say, I'm cool, I'm good, I'm all right. That's the depth of their emotional literacy. I'm good, I'm cool, I'm all right. So, they can't say I'm hurt, I'm scared, and I feel insecure because they don't have the vocabulary, right? It's in there, but they don't have it to get out. So I think we have to use words with young people. How are you feeling? Are you feeling insecure? Are you whatever it is, but we have to begin to develop that emotional literacy. And as Brother David John said, lastly, is to be present, listen, and support, right? It's to really hear young people and not tell young people what they need to do, but really listen and support them.
Agreed. I definitely want to add in terms of what you said in terms of emotional literacy. I think at a core level, we need to humanize our youth, right? Because so many times they're told they're not human in so many different ways, either verbally or just seeing ways that we're being slaughtered on the streets, right? So how do we humanize our youth in terms of letting them know, I see you, I hear you, I value you? That is healing in and of itself. And then when you talked about the adults, absolutely, we've experienced so much trauma, and many of us who are parents have experienced so much trauma that they might seek support for their child, but they haven't sought support for themselves. And so then they end up the intergenerational transfer of trauma because they've never healed from their trauma. So how do we give parents, it's okay for you to get help too. That's a sign of a good parent because you're trying to do whatever you can to be in the best space for your child, right? The other thing is in terms of for ourselves and for our youth, I'll call it the 3 S's: safety, structure, support, right? So our children need to feel safe. No matter what, we need to feel safe. And unfortunately, some of our youth in COVID land are not safe in their homes. So what do we do to support those youth who do not feel safe in their homes or out of COVID or in COVID? If you don't feel safe in your community, how are we addressing safety issues? Number 2, structure. How are we providing some type of structure, some type of routine in our homes for ourselves and for our youth? Because having structure helps for those who experience trauma, knowing that some sense of routine, and then support, saying it's okay to get mental health help, right? So again, going back to that stigma, knowing it's okay. But as Dr. Breland said, it's not enough of us out there. You know what I'm saying? If you want to get professional help from a mental health person who's Black, right? A woke Black person, let me say that also. But we have to also think about, if it's not from a Black person, make sure that person is culturally grounded. They're providing culturally grounded services and they have that expertise in that, right? So getting that support for your child or yourself. Also, we have to raise awareness about suicide, what's going on in our communities. We have to have these open conversations in our churches, in our barbershops, in our beauty shops, in our parks and rec. It's all hands on deck at this point. We all need to be advocating and really linking our children for services. We need to also advocate for social justice policies because we have to make sure people are accountable for treating our children in a respectful way. And lastly, as we talked about before, it is my hope that what we can do for our children is focus less on trying to change the hearts and minds of people whose hearts and minds don't want to change. We can give you some information. You can have your book clubs and all that, right? But let's focus most of our energy on healing. How do we heal our Black youth? And so I think all of those things, in culmination, can provide a different experience for our Black youth so they feel valued and they feel a sense that there is help if you need it, right? That we've all struggled, we hear you, we see you, we value you, we need you, we want you here. So how do we really instill that in our youth?
One thing, cultivate a spirit of grace, grace for yourself and grace for our young people. That's it.
Thank you. I'm sure this conversation could go on, and we are out of time, but there's some brilliant questions that have been shared by people in the chat, our attendees, who are hungry for more information and guidance. And so what I will commit to doing is collecting some responses to those questions and sharing them through CAAASA, whom we are so grateful to have had host us here today. This is such critical and important work. You can follow any of the panelists on Twitter, and each panelist is available to do talks and trainings and is out in the world continuing to inform the work of building our Black communities' mental health and wholeness and well-being. I'm Kia Darling-Hammond. It's been an absolute pleasure